Hi everyone, I'm David Johansen. Today I'll be talking about why not all iterations are equal, and I'll be comparing the Scrum, Kanban, and DevOps methodologies. All three are iterative approaches, yet the way iteration is structured changes how teams work, how flexible they can be, and ultimately how productive they feel. As an overview, the three iterative software development processes we'll be talking about today, Scrum, Kanban, and DevOps, all use iteration, but they differ in three key areas. Iteration is often treated as the holy grail of modern software development. Farley and Fowler argue that as long as you're iterative, you're on the right path. But experience shows that how a team iterates matters just as much. Some iterative frameworks add more value, and others introduce unnecessary friction. Today we'll focus on the three approaches Scrum, Kanban, and DevOps, comparing how they differ in flexibility, autonomy, and management overhead. At its core, iteration means continuous improvement. We build a small piece, test it, gather feedback, and improvement. This encourages early feedback and course correction. This is very different from waterfall, where feedback comes only at the end. However, simply calling a process iterative does not guarantee efficiency. Some iterative systems become rigid or bureaucratic, which defeats the purpose. So the real question is, does being iterative automatically make a process effective? Scrum is probably the most structured of the three. It divides work into sprints, usually 2 weeks long, with defined roles like Scrum Master and Product Owner. As you can see in the image, it contains lots of meetings and ceremonies, such as sprint planning, daily stand-ups, and sprint reviews. This provides structure and predictability. In my experience, that structure can turn heavy. I've seen teams spend hours in meetings instead of coding, especially when management emphasizes metrics over collaboration. Scrum works well for larger teams that need coordination, but too much process can reduce flexibility and autonomy. Kanban takes a different approach. No sprints, no roles, just a visual board. Tasks move across columns, like to do, in progress, and done. The simplicity of the status of tasks in Kanban allows for low management overhead and minimizing communication and documentation required for tasks. It's extremely flexible, as priorities can shift daily. Teams feel empowered because they manage their own flow. However, without discipline or clear goals, Kanban can become reactive, always chasing the latest issue instead of planning strategically. Still, in smaller, mature teams, Kanban tends to produce high morale and fast delivery. DevOps extends iteration beyond development into operations. Instead of building software and handing it to another team, DevOps integrates deployment, testing, and monitoring into the same continuous loop. Automation tools like CI/CD pipelines make iteration nearly constant, as every commit can trigger a build and deploy. However, these automated processes introduce an additional risk when they don't behave as necessary and need fixing. This can require additional work to be able to continue the development cycle. The benefit, though, is tight feedback and shared responsibility, with its drawback of complexity, as not every team has the infrastructure or culture to maintain it effectively. When done right, DevOps achieves the fastest learning cycles of all three, but introduces additional complexity and risk. Here's a quick summary of the three iterative software development processes we discussed. Scrum provides moderate flexibility, moderate autonomy, and high overhead as a result of its ceremonies and rigid structure. Kanban gives high flexibility and autonomy with the least overhead because of its simplistic nature. DevOps pushes flexibility and autonomy to the maximum, but introduces medium overhead due to tooling and monitoring. This comparison highlights that the best process depends on the context of the team and the project. Some teams can thrive with structure, while others benefit more from autonomy and flexibility. Here's where I'd like you to pause for a moment. Think about a project or team you've been a part of or have done in the past, whether in school or work. Would it perform better or have performed better under Scrum's structure, Kanban's flow, or DevOps automation? There's no single right answer, as your answer depends on how you, your teammates, and/or the project handles flexibility and self-organization. Some projects will benefit greatly from rapid delivery of DevOps. Some teams may value the rigid structure of Scrum, and some individuals may perform most effectively with the simplicity of a Kanban board. So go ahead and pause the video, reflect for a bit, and then continue. Let's return to real-world implementation with an experience of mine. I've worked with two teams that both followed iterative software development processes and also implemented parts of other iterative software development processes. One team, let's call Team A, followed a Scrum process with multiple project managers, reports, and rigid sprint goals. It also had an automated feedback process, like in DevOps process. The result? More meetings, less productivity, and lower morale. However, once development was initially finished, feedback was pretty quick and turnaround and corrections were fast. The other team, let's call them Team B, used a simple Kanban-like board and automated deployments. With this, everyone was engaged and efficient. Daily meetings typically lasted 5 minutes, and developers had ample time to focus on their work. However, with this approach, sometimes requirements weren't explained very well, and typically lots of impromptu Teams calls were needed to finish a task. Both teams were iterative, and they embraced different characteristics of the three processes, and they also had their advantages and disadvantages. This shows that success isn't about the label or a specific process, but it's about how the team uses iteration to empower rather than constrain. So when should you use each framework? Scrum fits well when coordination and predictability matter, such as large teams or projects with multiple stakeholders. Kanban excels for ongoing support, research, or small cross-functional teams where work arrives continuously. DevOps is ideal when fast feedback and frequent releases are critical, especially if automation is mature. In practice, teams often blend the methodologies. For example, combining Scrum with Kanban boards or Kanban principles within DevOps pipelines. To wrap up, remember this: iteration is a mindset, not a guarantee. Scrum provides structure, Kanban provides flow, and DevOps provides continuity. Each are valuable in its own context, but the best outcomes happen when teams balance autonomy with just enough structure and minimize unnecessary management overhead. Ultimately, what matters is not that you iterate, but how your iteration supports learning, adaptability, and morale. That's the real difference between merely iterative and truly agile software engineering. Here I have the references for this presentation, including Fowler's UML Distilled, Farley's Modern Software Engineering, and industry documentation from Atlassian and Microsoft Azure DevOps. I've also listed the sources for all the images used in this presentation. Well, that wraps up this presentation. Thank you for listening.